Part 3, Missouri Irish, A History of the Irish in America, by Michael C. O'Laughlin. Copyright 2010, from the Irish Roots Cafe and irishroots.com.
Chapter 3, Immigration and Distribution. The first immigrants coming in large numbers were from Ireland, brave by nature, inured to poverty and hardship. Quickly following the Irish were the Germans. There is much that they can copy from the Irish, and much that the Irish can learn from the Germans. Bishop McQuaid. The National Picture. The largest foreign-born group to enter America up until 1860 were the Irish, with a population of 1,800,000. The Germans numbered 1,500,000, and the English 740,000. The remainder were mainly French, French-Canadian, Swiss, Dutch, and Scandinavian. Prior to 1830, there were only some 500,000 foreign-born in the U.S. Between 1830 and 1850, over 2,500,000 entered the country. Another 2,700,000 arrived by 1860. The famine years and those following were years of tremendous population growth in America. The lands west of the Mississippi acted as a natural overflow valve for the eastern states. German settlement began in earnest in the 1830s, and by 1900, one-half of Missouri's foreign-born residents were German. The Irish-born had been reduced to 1/7 of the foreign-born. The Irish had always settled in St. Louis, preferring the city to the farm. In 1870, 34,813 of the 54,983 Irish were in St. Louis. Almost one-half of the Scottish settlers were there as well. 1,430 of the total 3,283. A decade earlier, St. Louis had become the largest foreign-born populated city in America. At that time, 1/3 were Irish and 1/2 were German. Kansas City, Jackson County, ranked second in the number of Irish-born in the state, and it was the only area where the Irish outnumbered the German born after 1850. 3,398 Irish, 2,310 German, 1,876 British American and England, 675 Norway and Sweden. St. Joseph, Buchanan County, ranked third in the number of Irish-born with a total of 2,055. The German total was 2,286. The role of the German immigrant cannot be overlooked. The Germans stayed on the farm more often than the Irish. Both German and Irish were of some Catholic population, but the Irish were more predominantly so. The German often favored the German language and made efforts to preserve it. The Irishman had the advantage of speaking English upon arrival and was therefore more readily accepted. The Roman Catholic religion was the largest denomination of the Irish-born in Missouri cities and throughout the West. The Presbyterian denomination was likely the second largest in the western cities for the Irish. Missouri's importance can be readily realized when comparing the populations of other western states. Missouri ranked a startling 8th in population in 1850, and ranked 5th in 1860 in the entire United States with 43,000 Irish-born. Minnesota in 1860 held 12,000 Irish, which comprised about 5% of the population. Nebraska held 1,000 Irish-born, found primarily in Omaha, Douglas County. Routes into Missouri. The Irish-born had always played an active role in bringing new immigrants into the state. The Irish Immigrant and Corresponding Society in St. Louis did so in 1818. The Hibernian Relief Society in 1827 and the Irish Immigrant Society in 1851 both encouraged immigration from their home base in St. Louis. Similar groups in the eastern cities fostered immigration to the west as well. The following extract from the Missouri Sixth Biennial Report illustrates the fact. Quote, I am devoting almost all my entire time in encouraging Irish immigrants to the southwestern counties of this state. I have already succeeded in leading about 300 families who command an average capital of at least $1,500 each, and in point of intelligence, integrity, and industry, they will compare favorably with the people of any country. Unquote. The majority of Irish immigrants had several traits in common. 1. Poverty, particularly for the famine immigrants. 2. The English language. 3. The Roman Catholic religion. The Scots-Irish were primarily Presbyterian. 4. The search for a better life. 5. They settled primarily in the cities, particularly during the famine era. 2 major routes were traveled by the immigrant moving into Missouri prior to the coming of the railroad: by ship from New Orleans up the Mississippi to St. Louis, and by wagon from the eastern seaboard. The Ohio River was utilized often. The end of large-scale immigration. By 1873, the immigration rate had declined dramatically. After that year, it fell from 459,000 to 169,000 in 1876. The Irish-born population began to decline throughout the nation, and newer immigrant groups began taking over some of the poorer Irish neighborhoods. By 1900, the Irish represented only 1/7 of the foreign-born population. Irish settlements in Missouri. The Irish arrived in Missouri in the early days of its history. In the 1700s, a considerable number settled in Perry County, where they furnished evidence of recognizing good land. A few families had settled near the Missouri River, in the mining districts, and in St. Louis at that time. According to Ellis, the Irish accepted the rough and menial tasks of hard labor due to their impoverished circumstances. They did not have the money to buy land or organize businesses immediately upon arrival, as the Germans did. They became, quote, principles of labor. But in the various departments of social, business, and intellectual development, their power has also been felt, unquote. While the majority of the Irish immigrants were found in St. Louis, the remaining numbers were spread throughout the state. Jefferson County contained no small numbers, and some of its first settlers included the Huskies, McCormicks, Clanes, McMillans, Donnells, and Pounds. These families were settled on the agricultural lands and were associated with the Anglo-Americans. Considerable numbers settled in Perry County on the Barrens, in the Boy Brule Bottom, and in Cape Girardeau County. A northern section of Cape Girardeau City was known for years as Donnybrook. The Irish colony in Ripley County, the Irish Wilderness Settlement, was founded in 1858 by the Reverend J.J. Hogan. This was primarily a Catholic settlement comprising many former railroad workers. Many Irish families had settled there earlier. Some had been driven from Ireland as Catholics generations ago, according to their own accounts. By the time of Hogan's settlement, they had joined existing congregations, not of the Catholic faith, due to the lack of any other religious facilities. Some once again became Catholic, others remained as they were. It was a matter of heated contention between the frontier preachers. In southwestern Missouri, 128 Irish individuals settled in Newton County, more than any other nationality save the Germans. The Irish settlement in Adena, in Knox County, was nearly 100% Irish when founded in 1841. Irishman Peter Early was one of its early promoters. The settlement was an Irish Catholic one. In later years, there was some religious conflict, which resulted in the local paper being bought out and reissued under another name by an Irish priest. Conception was a similar Irish settlement in southeast Nottoway County. Other settlements worthy of mention by Ellis were found in Lincoln, Marion, and Warren counties. The Irish settlements in Ripley, Newton, and Lawrence counties were said to be strictly Catholic ones. The following place names were also noted as indicating an Irish population: Dublin in Barton County, McGurk's in Moniteau County, and Irish Grove in Atchison County. By 1870, the number of Irish born in Missouri was approximately 55,000, with 32,000 in St. Louis, and the remaining 23,000 located principally in some of the western river counties, both north and south of the Missouri, in groups along the Mississippi, and in Lawrence, Newton, and Berry counties in the southwest part of the state. It is curious to note that Jackson and Buchanan counties were omitted by Ellis. They represented the second and third largest counties of Irish birth, encompassing Kansas City and St. Joseph. He was apparently ignoring the concentration of the Irish in the cities, focusing on specific Irish settlements. On the preference of the Irish concerning city life over the farm, Ellis states, quote, "The Irish, while naturally an agricultural people, were directed by force of circumstances to commercial centers, factories, mines, railroads, etc. Many of the more fortunate, however, became active leaders in religious work, and the small percent that became farmers were generally successful as such, and bore no marks which separated them from Anglo-Americans." Unquote. The census of 1850 also supports the preference of the Irish for the city. Of 14,734 living in Missouri, 9,719 were in St. Louis, which left 5,015 scattered over the remainder of the state. This was a higher rate than that of the Germans, who remained more often on the farm. It must be remembered that these figures concentrate on the post-famine Irish, who were more destitute than the earlier Irish. The Irish arriving before the famine appear to have concentrated in cities as well. Missouri can boast the likes of men like Broken Hand Fitzpatrick, who led a group which discovered the elusive South Pass in 1824. The pass was needed for early travel through the Rocky Mountains. As the explorers cleared the way for increasing immigration, the Irish continued to concentrate in the cities. The German immigrant was said to have had a greater desire to remain reclusive, away from the city life. The Irish viewpoint may be seen in this quote from an Irish farmer in Missouri. He was doing quite well materially, but remained unhappy. He, quote, "rejoiced in land and stock, no rent, light taxes, free shooting, and above all, social equality," unquote. But life on the Missouri farm was not perfect. He continues, "In Ireland, quote, I could then go to a fair, a wake, or dance, or I would spend the winter's night at a neighbor's house cracking jokes by a turf fire. I would have a neighbor within every 100 yards of me that would run to see me. But everyone here can get so much land that they calls them neighbors that lives 2 or 3 miles off. Och, the sorra take such neighbors, I would say, and then I would sit down and cry and curse him who made me leave home." Unquote. Several reasons may account for the Irish move to the cities in larger than average numbers. The possibilities include: 1. The Irish arrived in destitute circumstances, particularly during the famine. They had less money than their German and British counterparts. They were therefore unable to purchase land upon arrival. 2. American farms were far larger and more remote than those in Ireland. The social structure of the community, as known in Ireland, was lost on the vast American farms. 3. Opportunities were available in the cities that had been denied the Irish for centuries, that is, freedom of the press and political office. The Irish soul longed to take advantage of these freedoms. 4. Most of the top Western cities were predominantly Roman Catholic by 1880. The vast majority of the Irish were of this faith, with strong ties to their church. The Presbyterian Irish were likely the second largest in the cities. 5. Becoming accustomed to city life and working on the railroad, the life on the farm would have represented a major change in lifestyle. In other words, how can we keep them on the farm after they've seen Gay Paris? 6. Speaking English was an advantage in the cities. Many Germans desired to keep their native tongue and ways, which kept them from the corrupting ways of the city. The Irishman had a natural advantage in his use of the English language. Upon interviewing modern-day residents in Nemaha County, Kansas, Mr. Ed Carter inquired as to why the old Irish farms had been taken over by the Germans. It seems as though the farms did quite well 4 generations ago with their Irish owners. Later generations lost interest and increasingly longed for the city, as did all America. We have found this type of incident to be true in a number of cases. Missouri foreign-born census figures appear on page 65 in this book. The surprising story of a German settlement. O'Fallon, Missouri. Arnold Kriegel was a descendant of early German settlers and judge of the U.S. District Court. In 1854, he gave the North Missouri Railroad, Norfolk and Western, right-of-way through his property. In 1855, he laid out a town then called the Kriegel Addition. The railroad was the only reliable means of transportation due to the lack of public roads. After the railroad received the right-of-way from Kriegel, Railroad Director John O'Fallon gave him the honor of naming the depot stop. Judge Kriegel returned the favor and named it after his friend of many years, John O'Fallon. Dr. James O'Fallon was John's father. James was an educated Irishman who served as Surgeon-in-Chief in the Continental Army under General Washington. Dr. O'Fallon left his genealogy documented for his descendants, stating that he was descended from Malachi O'Fallon. Dr. O'Fallon left his genealogy documented for his descendants, stating that he was descended from Malachi O'Fallon, Prince of the Desies, in Ireland. The Gaelic spelling of O'Fallon would differ. The doctor moved to Louisville, Kentucky after the war, where he married Frances Clark, sister of the famed George R. and William Clark. After his death, she married Charles M. Thurston. John O'Fallon was educated in Louisville and later wounded in the Battle of Tippecanoe. Upon returning to St. Louis and his distinguished military career, he eventually took command of a company and was stationed at Fort Mackinac. He made St. Louis his home after Army retirement and was elected to the first state legislature in 1821. O'Fallon, promoter of the Pacific Railroad, was the first president of the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad. He served as the first Adjutant General of Missouri and was visitor examiner at West Point Military Academy. His credits include being director in the State Bank of Missouri and financing the Planters and Lindell hotels. Writing of him 8 years before his death, local historian Edwards stated in part, quote, "A charity unparalleled. He has already bestowed more than $1 million to education, science, to relieve the wants of suffering humanity," unquote. He donated the grounds of St. Louis University, the First Methodist Church, the Waterworks, O'Fallon Polytechnic Institute, $100,000, and built the dispensary and medical college of Washington University. Freedom, frankness, and generosity were recognized traits of this Irish American, who died on December 17, 1865, in St. Louis. Miscellaneous note on O'Fallon City. The O'Fallon Christian Church belongs to a denomination known as the Disciples of Christ, which was founded by Alexander Campbell, among others, of County Antrim. Many thanks to the kind help of the City Hall of O'Fallon, Missouri. The early Irish settlement of Donnybrook in Cape Girardeau. In Ellis' book on the influence of the environment on Missouri, he cites Donnybrook in Cape Girardeau as an early Irish settlement. As early as 1799, Michael Quinn traded there. The first Methodist church west of the Mississippi, McKendree Chapel, was formed here, and from 1806 on, meetings were held. In the fall of 1806 or the spring of 1807, the first congregation was formed. Dennis Sullivan taught school in this settlement. Donnybrook was located around the 700 and 800 block of Spanish Street, adjacent to the Mississippi River and the St. Louis and San Francisco Railroad. In place when the town began to grow, prior to the arrival of the German immigrants, it was a rough-and-tumble area of the frontier. Sander states in Cape Girardeau, Biography of a City, that the Germans arrived during a period of growth. Their lifestyle differed considerably from that of the Irish in Donnybrook. Although some functions were attended by all, high society, fancy dress balls were not a part of the Irish settlers' way of life. Speaking of the German settlers of the day, Sander states, quote, "The rough and tumble fun of Donnybrook was not acceptable to the stern papa and his frau, and still less to high society," unquote. At local contests and fairs, wrestling, weightlifting, running, jumping, and tests of physical prowess were popular. Animal baiting and cockfighting were common. It may be inferred that a rough physical lifestyle encompassing hard labor was a fact of life. This was generally true on the frontier. Irish settlers in Missouri counties. In Pettis County, a colony of 20 Irish Catholic families settled in Spring Fork and built the first church, St. Patrick's, in 1876. Among the prominent families were the Malachi O'Briens and the Donahues. In 1858, Eugene Owen Sullivan was agent for the Missouri Pacific Railway at Dresden. He was originally from County Kerry, Ireland. Dennis Connor was born in Cahersiveen, County Kerry, Ireland. In 1842, he was a member of the Union Army, and his family worked the railroad prior to the Civil War. Michael Buckley, born 1822 in County Cork, Ireland, came to America in 1851 and was a railroad contractor in several states. Settling on a farm in Pettis in 1863, he was a great proponent of planting potatoes on St. Patrick's Day. He was said to have had the largest harvest of the same, even in times of scarcity. In Knox County, Edina was one of the purest Irish settlements in the state, as well as the county seat. Edina was said to have been the only Catholic settlement up to 1870 in this county. In 1840, Irishman Peter Early established the first colony, along with James Reed, John Moore, and Jody Cody, all Catholics from Ohio. The first church was built in 1842 with the help of non-Catholics, and the Methodists used the cemetery. Peter Early was an early promoter of the area and advertised for settlers in this bountiful land. In 1825, in Morgan County, Hugh Alexander, James Samuel, and William Kelsey settled on the Moreau Creek, 6 miles east of Versailles. William Donegan and Thomas Kennedy arrived shortly thereafter. In 1829, Willis and Cyrus C. Brown arrived. North of the Kelsey settlement, William Kirkpatrick settled. To the west, Samuel Kelsey David McFarland, and William McCarroll settled. In Nottoway County, Isaac Hogan, Daniel Hogan, and Richard Taylor were among the first settlers in 1839, having arrived from Tennessee. One of the first 6 settlers was William O'Bannon in 1818 in Pettis County. O'Bannon, who had fled earlier religious persecution, was an early settler on Muddy Creek. In the Pin Hook vicinity in 1818, he was one of 10 sons of Brian Boru O'Bannon from County Mayo, Ireland. Brian had settled in Tangier County, Virginia, with 2 brothers. He was a private in Bradley's company in 1776. Allen O'Bannon later served as county judge and state legislature representative in 1770. John O'Bannon was among the first members of the First Church in the Georgetown area. This story repeats itself often. Irish who would flee Ireland for religious freedom would fight in the Revolutionary War, settle in the South, and later settle in Missouri. In Rawls County in 1811, James Ryan was the first permanent white settler in the county. His land was deeded in September on Salt River. At that time, the county was included in St. Charles. In 1806, in Iron County, Elijah O'Bannon came from Virginia and in 1818 built the first brick house in the county. Mr. William Kelly would open the first store in Martinsville in Montgomery County. In Dallas County, Joe Miles, an Irish bachelor, was the first to settle on the site of Buffalo and gave the town its name. In Warren County, the first settlements were made in 1801 to 1802 by Flanders Calloway, David Bryan, William and Robert Ramsey. Thomas Kennedy settled in the northern section. The first grand jury there included Samuel Doherty, Denoni McClure, and Jared Irwin. The first court included Morgan Bryan. Murphy's Cave, located in Ides Hill, was in the center of Hannibal. In Sullivan County, the first county court included William Doyle and Patrick McCown. George Irwin was county treasurer. E. Hannon was the first postmaster of the county. In 1839, John McCullough and S.A. Maloney were already settled. A decade later, we find A.L. Gilstrap as receiver at the U.S. Land Office at Milan. In Morgan County, the first resident lawyer in Versailles was James McCord, and in 1875, the first bank was started by J.P. Kelsey. In St. Genevieve, Edward Walsh built the first steam mill in 1818. 2 years earlier, William MacArthur may have been the first to duel on the steps of the Territorial Courthouse. In 1789, Major George McCully was there in a party commanded by Colonel Morgan. Hugh McDermott was there in 1809 drafting a memorial to Congress. John Scott, an attorney from St. Genevieve, was elected delegate of the territory in 1817. Platte County. In 1837, Martinsville was founded. 2 of the earliest settlers there were Joe and John Mulligan, who were saloon keepers. In 1831, a line ran from Leavenworth to Liberty and was used tri-weekly by hack. Robert Kane was cited as having been allowed to settle at Todd's Creek for a change of horses. In 1835 to 1836, settlers were evicted by the soldiers from the fort, but as a matter of convenience, he was allowed to remain there. By 1837, Kane had taken charge of the ferry at the fort. Robert Kane was reported to have possessed all the kindness, hospitality, and good nature of the typical pioneer. No kindness was asked of him in vain, and no possession was too good for a guest. True and generous to a fault, he was rich in lands and stock, but could not cope with the arts and frauds of civilization. The only legacy left his children was of a spiritual nature, which should have done them well. We have no confirmation of Cain's ethnic background, but he is representative of some of the earlier pioneers who were not part of the civilization which was about to take over in the western lands. Like the mountain men, he was a different breed and would soon vanish from prominence. Cain, C-A-I-N, and C-A-N-E, were used as English forms of the name Kane, K-A-N-E, in Ireland. As is so often the case, the Anglicization of Irish surnames has led to difficulties in determining origins. In 1846, W.S. Murphy, born 1814, died 1856, raised the first company of infantry for the Mexican War from Platte County. He would join the forces of Kearny and Doniphan in that campaign. He soon became a captain, and his brother Joseph was commissioner of the courthouse, which was erected after the Civil War. David R. Holt, M.D., died 1840, was a county representative and Speaker of the House. His great-grandparents were from Ireland, of Scots-Irish heritage. David was a Presbyterian minister, and his brother Joseph was a doctor, as was David. One of the founders of Weston was of Irish heritage as well, James Lynch. Glasgow. The town of Glasgow was settled by English and Protestant settlers around 1860. The Miller and Monaghan families there were specifically named as being Irish. McClintock's Brickyard was established by 1860, and the Glasgow Times newspaper has been frequently cited as early as 1849. Captain William Swinney brought his family from Lynchburg, Virginia, and established a large plantation east of Glasgow. He brought some locust trees along with him, which he transplanted to the area. Monroe County. In 1820, the first settlements were made, and the Irish and German soon predominated. The early settlers were a band of Irish Catholics from Kentucky and Maryland. School opened in 1834, taught by Joseph Hogan, with 75 pupils. The voting population was 160, 154 of whom were Democrats. Callaway County. Some of the Irish settlers documented include John Riley, 1825, Charles Doherty of Ireland, coming from Baltimore, 1817, and Mr. David Kennedy, 1876. Newton County. Patrick Murphy, born 1839, founded Murfreesburg near Joplin. Worth County. In 1841, Perry McCulley arrived from Daviess County. David Teague arrived from Illinois, and Andrew McIlvaine is recorded as well. In 1846, E.W. Lynch, Alfred Taylor, Daniel McKim, and Judge William Milligan arrived. In 1860, notable settlers included John Mahari and William McKnight from Jackson. Camden County. Erie was its second county seat. Clark County. In 1837, St. Patrick's Parish was established. St. Charles County. In 1804, James Flaherty was Justice of the Peace. In 1806, James Murdoch of Dublin was present. He had 7 children, some of whom settled in this county also. They included schoolteacher Catherine Kennedy, his daughter-in-law, who had married his son George. James Murdoch had arrived in America before the Revolution. In 1825, Jerry Sullivan, a Baptist and Revolutionary War veteran, came to settle. In 1807, Abraham Kennedy built a fort and became a member of Nathan Boone's Rangers in 1812. Old Franklin. The Reverend Francis McFarland formed a church at Old Franklin opposite Booneville in January of 1821, just as Missouri was admitted into the Union. Jefferson County. In 1838, Hugh O'Neill, landowner, donated 50 acres along with Samuel Mary to the county. Chariton. Stephen Donahoe traveled from Virginia to Chariton around 1820 by way of keelboat, setting up a general merchandise store. Jackson County. The Christian denomination was the first to settle in Lone Jack, Missouri. The first preachers to arrive in the state were Elder Mulkey and Thomas and James McBride. In 1830, Isaac Dunaway built a cabin west of what became the town, near Russell Park. David Graham settled later that year, followed by the Thomas McKnight and Shahan families in the 30s. In 1872, George W. Shahan came from Bourbon, Kentucky, and established a distillery within 1 year, as well as beginning a peach orchard. Jackson County later became the second largest Irish-born populated county in Missouri, due to the large Irish population in Kansas City. Boone County. James M. MacDonald, a native of Cork, Ireland, was born in 1828. He was a prominent developer in the Columbia, Missouri area. Constitutional Convention. 68 delegates were elected to the convention, January 26, 1875. Only Mr. T.J. Kelly died before the convention convened. Other delegates included Charles B. McAfee of Springfield, Edward McCabe of Springfield, Archibald V. McKee of Troy, and Malcolm McKillop of Rockport. Law and Politics. In 1804, James Flaherty was Justice of the Peace in St. Charles County. The first Justice of the Peace and Sheriff in St. Louis was Irish at this time as well. In St. Genevieve, McDonough was Chief of Police in 1873. Stephen H. Sullivan, born September 1849 in Franklin County, was Deputy Sheriff of that county. Sullivan was the eldest of 4 children of Wiley and Eliza Tease Sullivan. He dug the first grave in the Sullivan graveyard. In 1833, in Morgan County, Alfred McCutcheon was sheriff, likely in Versailles. Not all Irish were on the right side of the law. John McCorkle was one of the members of Quantrill's band of raiders, and the famous Jesse James was of strong maternal Irish heritage. Moving on from Missouri. Missouri served as the gateway west for settlers from throughout America and abroad. St. Louis became the melting pot of the nation with nearly 60% of its population foreign-born by 1860. 1/3 of these foreign-born were Irish, 1/2 were German. Many of the migrants from the southern states were Irish Americans arriving from the 1820s onward in considerable numbers. Kansas City and St. Joseph held more Irish than any other cities west of St. Louis on the western side of the state. Kansas City, Jackson County, was the only area which still held more Irish-born than German by 1860. Many of the settlers in Missouri would travel further west. Settling predominantly in the cities, these sons and daughters of Missouri earned her the title of the Mother of the West. The migrations from Missouri had begun early in the 1800s. Ties with Texas were strong by blood in the 1820s, and many prominent Missouri families had family in that state. Some came originally from Kentucky and Virginia before arriving in Missouri. Thomas F. McKinney, born 1801 in Kentucky, moved to Missouri in 1801 with his family. He was engaged in Santa Fe trade and was one of the old 300 of Colonel Austin's original settlers in Texas, most of whom were Missourians. Austin served in the Missouri legislature along with James Kerr at an early date. Johnson Calhoun, a near victim of the New Madrid earthquakes in 1811, left for Texas in 1832. By the mid-1800s, Missourians were moving primarily to California, Arkansas, Texas, and Oregon. They formed the largest outside group in Oregon, although settling there in smaller numbers than the rest of the mentioned states. During the first waves of migration, while the mountain men and explorers mapped the frontier in the 1820s, wagon loads of immigrants moved into Missouri daily. They came from Illinois on the east and Kentucky, Tennessee, and Arkansas on the southeast. Missourians had already traveled to Texas in some numbers in that decade. With so much new blood, the ways of the old French inhabitants gave way to newer traditions. Graceful French dancing soon gave way to songs like Old Dan Tucker, The Sailor's Hornpipe, and Great Tater in Sandy Land. Areas like Franklin, Missouri reflected New England, New York, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ireland, England, and Scandinavian lifestyles. Wrestling, fighting, hunting, hard work, and play were part of everyday life. Missouri was an amalgamation of various ethnic backgrounds. She served as the crossroads of American life. Those leaving during the 1820s could have done so in a wagon made by Joseph Murphy. Over 200,000 Murphy wagons would fill the frontier in the years to come, reaching a peak by the middle of the century. The famine immigrants from Ireland, beginning in 1845, would be among those riding in Murphy wagons. Another Murphy, Martin Murphy, and Sons left for California in 1840 from St. Louis after the death of his wife. They were to settle in Santa Clara County. Many left for California looking for the gold in the hills subsequently. William McDonald left in 1846, followed by Samuel Green McMahon and his brother Nelson in 1841. By 1849, entire caravans left for California. Captain Abe McPike of Pike County formed a wagon train to California in that year. One wonders if they traveled in Murphy's wagons. Those who wanted a non-stop, dependable journey usually did. It could stand the rigors of the unprecedented trip to the coast. Cornelius Gilliam was another caravan leader in 1844. His destination was Oregon. Hall Jackson Kelly, a New Englander, published a pamphlet on Oregon in 1830 and left 2 years later for St. Louis on the first leg of his journey there. Thomas McBride, the elder and first preacher of the Christian Church in Missouri, traveled to Oregon and died there. John R. McBride left to become a leading lawyer in Spokane, Washington. George N. McConaughey, born 1820 in Ohio, came to Missouri in 1845 and practiced law at Canton, Boonville, Louisiana, and Bowling Green. He left for California in 1850. Elected to the first territorial legislature of Washington, he drowned in a canoe on the return trip home. Joseph K. Toole, born in Savannah, Missouri, became the first governor of Montana. His brother, Edward Warren Toole, went successfully as well. Many traveled to remote areas to find plentiful game. Jonathan Keeney, Missouri, worked for a fur company in the Boise, Idaho basin in 1834. These early travelers had not set down permanent roots. In the space of 1 or 2 generations, it was not uncommon to have been in 2 countries and lived in several states in America. John McGinnis traveled from Ireland to Virginia to Kentucky. His son came to Missouri in 1832, possibly to make a permanent home. One thing was certain. There was much talk and great hope for a future for those who made the journey. Admitted to the Union. When Missouri was admitted to the Union in 1821, among the designs and banners displayed in celebration was that of the American eagle atop an Irish harp, fitting symbolism for these new Americans who helped bring Missouri into the Union. Chapter 4. The Irish in the Cities. The story of the Irish west of the Mississippi culminates in the cities of frontier America. They were settled there en masse by 1880. Concentrated there, even more so than the German immigrants, the cities of America were the home of the Irish. The railroad played a major role in the development of these cities. It would employ Irish laborers and carry countless others to their city of destination. The Irish settled along the path of the rail, congregating in the cities at the end of the line. For immigrants prior to the famine, the railroad was non-existent. The Murphy wagon was the preferred form of transportation prior to the railroad. For many post-famine immigrants, the railroad became a way of life which was neither easy nor settled. Alternative means of employment often did not exist. 5 of the first railroads, which started with state aid and employed many Irish, were 1. The Pacific Railroad of Missouri, due west from St. Louis to Kansas City. 2. The Northern Missouri Railroad, St. Louis to Omaha. 3. The Southwest Branch of the Pacific Railroad, southwest from St. Louis. 4. St. Louis and Iron Mountain Railroad, due south from St. Louis. 5. The Hannibal and St. Joseph Railroad, 1859, the first to cross the state. The Hannibal and St. Joseph line connected with St. Louis through the Northern Missouri line at Macon. 4 years earlier, the Pacific line went from St. Louis to Jefferson City. By 1865, this reached Kansas City on the western border. By 1858, the St. Louis and Iron Mountain line had an 86-mile track to the Pilot Knob mining district. Another line reached Rolla by 1861. The Great Eads Bridge in St. Louis was completed in 1874. A railroad from Cincinnati has disembarked on the east bank of the river in St. Louis since 1857. The Iron Mountain line seems to be one which employed many of the Irish who joined Hogan at the Irish Wilderness Settlement. The Reverend Hogan mentions several railroad encampments in his book. He specifically cites the Hannibal and St. Joseph line. All his references to the railroad throughout the state concern the Irish in some manner. The cities. Gateway West. At one point, the only true city west of the Mississippi was St. Louis. Founded in 1764 as a fur trading post by the French, by 1850 the city was no longer a town of the West. It had become the final outpost of the East. The Irish played a major role in St. Louis from its inception under American control in 1804. The number one foreign-born group in the city by 1820, they outnumbered the original French and Spanish-born residents of the town. St. Louis went on to become the largest foreign-born populated city in the U.S. The famine immigrants from Ireland would settle there in record numbers after 1845. By 1850, she was the 5th largest city in the nation. The accomplishments of the Irish in St. Louis some 50 years earlier will become apparent to the reader. Kansas City in 1821 did not exist. A frontier town in 1850, she vied with St. Joseph, Missouri, Leavenworth, and Atchison, Kansas, for superiority. The railroad was a determining factor in Kansas City's success. She won the struggle with the first bridge over the Missouri River. Kansas City triumphed as a result of private initiative. The Irish arrived here from New York and Boston in 1856 to level the streets of the city from the bluffs. Robert Kennedy began the first paper in 1851. By 1880, the city was 83% native-born and no longer a frontier town. 2,208 of her 5,620 foreign workers were Irish, the rest mainly German. She held as well the largest number of black workers of any frontier city. Of 4,550 laborers, most came from the meat packing houses. 2,101 were clerks, 1,830 domestic laborers, and 1,301 were carpenters. Other Western towns felt the influence of the railroad and Irish settlement. All of the towns in this chapter held a population of 8,000 or more by 1880. Many had humble beginnings. Oakland, California rose from a squatter's field. Lawrence, Kansas from an anti-slavery center to an agricultural marketing point. San Francisco's growth was due to the gold rush and her superior harbor. San Francisco and Denver appeared out of nowhere. Lincoln, Nebraska, and Topeka, Kansas grew from being centers of government of the region. In Texas, San Antonio, an old Spanish town, Austin, and Dallas grew rapidly after the arrival of the railroad. Houston based her hopes on the railroad, as Galveston relied on shipyards while fighting for prominence in Texas. Omaha grew from its location as the eastern end of the Union Pacific Railroad. Other centers of population in 1880 included Sacramento, San Jose, Stockton, Portland, Virginia City, and Salt Lake City, Utah. A breakdown of their ethnic and religious population follows. 1/2 of San Francisco's workers were foreign-born, with more Irish than any other nationality. There were 17,012 Irish, 12,394 German, and some 6,000 British-born workers in the city. 2,461 domestic servants and 3,467 laborers were Irish-born. In Oakland, the Irish comprised about 10% of the population, but were involved in 37% of the arrests in 1880. In Denver, 1,226 workers were Irish, of a total 5,247 foreign-born. The employment rate in these cities was said to have been high, due in part, perhaps, to the number of able-bodied workers who had arrived alone, searching for employment. As one source put it, quote, "The women and children and aged were left behind when they went to seek their fortune," unquote. As the chart on page 82 verifies, the vast majority of the Irish in the cities was of Roman Catholic religion. A smaller amount of Irish Presbyterians were normally present in all the cities by 1880. The Catholics outnumbered all other denominations in every city except Salt Lake City. New Irish Catholic arrivals felt at home in the cities.
End of Part 3. Continue on to Part 4 of Missouri Irish. Copyright 2010 from the Irish Roots Cafe and IrishRoots.com.